In early 1952, while serving in Europe, Eisenhower began seeing reports that made him pause. Douglas MacArthur, the legendary general who had once been his superior, was considering a run for president, the same office Eisenhower himself was being urged to seek. For a moment, those who knew Eisenhower later said, the news confirmed what he already believed, a judgment formed over decades of working together, an understanding built on years of observation. What Eisenhower thought about MacArthur's ambitions would reveal everything about their relationship, a rivalry that stretched back to the 1930s, a conflict that had shaped both their careers, and a competition that was about to reach its final chapter. This is that story. To understand what happened in 1952, we need to go back to 1930, back to when Dwight Eisenhower was just a young major and Douglas MacArthur was already a legend. MacArthur had been a hero in World War I. He had commanded the famous Rainbow Division. He had been superintendent of West Point. And now he was the Army Chief of Staff, the highest position in the military. Eisenhower was assigned to be his assistant. It should have been the opportunity of a lifetime, and in many ways it was. Eisenhower learned how the highest levels of the military worked. He saw how decisions were made, how politics and military strategy intersected. But he also saw something else. He saw Douglas MacArthur up close, and what he saw troubled him. MacArthur was brilliant, no one disputed that. His mind worked faster than almost anyone Eisenhower had ever met. He could recall details from battles fought decades earlier. He understood strategy at a level few could match. But MacArthur also had another quality. Eisenhower later described it carefully in his diary. MacArthur had an enormous ego. He believed in his own greatness, and he expected everyone around him to believe in it too. Eisenhower was different. He was methodical, humble, a team player. He believed in getting the job done, not in getting the credit. The two men could not have been more opposite in temperament. Yet they worked together for years, first in Washington, then in the Philippines, where MacArthur was sent to help build up the Philippine Army in preparation for independence. Those years in the Philippines were difficult for Eisenhower. He was far from home, the work was frustrating, the resources were limited, and MacArthur was a demanding boss. In his diary, Eisenhower wrote things he never said out loud. He called MacArthur's ego something to behold. He noted how MacArthur took credit for work others had done, how he rewrote history to make himself look better. Eisenhower kept these thoughts private, but he never forgot them. Then came World War II, and everything changed. When war broke out in Europe, Eisenhower was called back to Washington. He was promoted quickly, recognized for his organizational skills and his ability to work with others. George Marshall, the Army Chief of Staff, saw something in Eisenhower. He saw a man who could handle coalition warfare, who could work with the British, with the Free French, with allies from a dozen nations, a man who put the mission above his own glory. MacArthur, meanwhile, was in the Pacific. After the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, he had been evacuated from the Philippines, leaving behind American and Filipino troops who would later surrender at Bataan. MacArthur famously promised, "I shall return," and he did. But while MacArthur commanded in the Pacific, Eisenhower was given the job that would make him famous: Supreme Commander of Allied Forces in Europe. This was the moment when their paths truly diverged. Eisenhower was leading the invasion of North Africa, then Sicily, then Italy, then France. He was coordinating with Churchill and Roosevelt. He was planning D-Day, the largest amphibious invasion in history. And he was doing it all with a style that was the opposite of MacArthur's. Eisenhower built consensus. He listened to his subordinates. He gave credit to others, and the world noticed. MacArthur noticed too. In the Pacific, he was winning his own victories, island hopping toward Japan, reclaiming the Philippines.
But the attention was on Eisenhower. The newsreels showed Eisenhower meeting with troops, Eisenhower planning the invasion of Normandy, Eisenhower accepting the surrender of Nazi Germany. MacArthur was a theater commander. Eisenhower was the face of Allied victory in Europe. After the war ended, the contrast became even starker. Eisenhower returned to a hero's welcome. He was made Army Chief of Staff, the same position MacArthur had once held. He was courted by both political parties to run for president. He became president of Columbia University. Everyone wanted a piece of Eisenhower. Everyone wanted him to lead. MacArthur, meanwhile, was in Japan. He had been appointed Supreme Commander of the Allied Powers, essentially the ruler of occupied Japan. It was an important job. MacArthur oversaw the transformation of Japan from a militarist empire to a democratic nation. It was his greatest achievement. But he was far from home, far from the spotlight, and increasingly he watched as Eisenhower's star continued to rise.
Then came Korea. In June 1950, North Korea invaded South Korea. The United Nations called for action. American troops were sent, and MacArthur was put in command. At first, things went badly. The North Koreans pushed American and South Korean forces into a small perimeter around the port of Pusan. It looked like defeat was imminent. But MacArthur pulled off one of the most brilliant operations of his career, the Incheon landing, an amphibious assault behind enemy lines that cut off the North Korean army and turned the tide of the war. Suddenly, MacArthur was back in the headlines, the genius, the hero, the man who had saved Korea. And then, just as quickly, it all fell apart. MacArthur pushed north toward the Chinese border. He promised that China would not intervene. He was wrong. Hundreds of thousands of Chinese troops poured across the border. The American forces were pushed back. The war became a stalemate, and MacArthur began publicly criticizing President Truman's limited war strategy. He wanted to expand the war into China. He wanted to use nuclear weapons if necessary. He wanted total victory. Truman had had enough. In April 1951, he fired MacArthur, relieved him of command, brought him home. It was one of the most controversial decisions of Truman's presidency. MacArthur returned to a hero's welcome. Millions of people lined the streets to see him. He gave a dramatic farewell address to Congress. "Old soldiers never die. They just fade away," he said. It was masterful theater. But MacArthur didn't fade away, not yet. Because almost immediately, people began talking about MacArthur running for president. He was famous. He was popular. He was a conservative hero who had been wronged by a Democratic president. Why shouldn't he run? Why shouldn't he take his case directly to the American people? This is where our story really begins. Because at the same time people were talking about MacArthur for president, they were also talking about someone else, Dwight Eisenhower. Eisenhower was still in Europe, serving as Supreme Commander of NATO. Both parties wanted him. Democrats thought he might be a Democrat. Republicans hoped he was a Republican. No one was quite sure, but everyone knew he could win. Eisenhower watched the MacArthur situation carefully. He heard the talk about MacArthur running for president. He heard MacArthur giving speeches that sounded increasingly political. And privately, Eisenhower was concerned. Not because he feared MacArthur would win, but because he knew something most Americans didn't know. He knew MacArthur. He had worked for him. He had seen his flaws up close.
In early 1952, Eisenhower made his decision. He would run for president as a Republican. He believed the country needed leadership that could unite people, not divide them. Leadership that could work with allies, not alienate them. Leadership that understood the dangers of the nuclear age. And whether he said it out loud or not, he believed he was that leader, not MacArthur. MacArthur's supporters tried to draft him into the race. They entered his name in some primaries. They urged him to declare his candidacy. And for a while, MacArthur seemed to consider it seriously. He gave speeches about the future of America, about the threat of communism, about the need for strong leadership. He never quite said he was running, but he never quite said he wasn't. Eisenhower kept his own counsel. In public, he said little about MacArthur. When asked about his former commander, he was always diplomatic. He praised MacArthur's military accomplishments. He noted their long history together. But he never endorsed MacArthur for president. And those who knew Eisenhower well could sense something beneath the surface, a tension, a history, a judgment left unspoken. The moment came at the Republican National Convention in July 1952. MacArthur was invited to give the keynote address. It was a prime speaking slot, a chance to make his case to the party, to show he was presidential material. The convention hall was packed. Delegates waited to hear what MacArthur would say. Would he announce his candidacy? Would he throw his support behind someone else? Would he go after Eisenhower? MacArthur spoke for nearly an hour. He talked about America's place in the world, about the fight against communism, about the need for moral clarity. It was vintage MacArthur, sweeping, dramatic, full of historical references and soaring rhetoric. But something was missing: fire, passion, the sense that this was a man ready to fight for the nomination. MacArthur seemed tired. His speech, while eloquent, felt like a farewell more than a beginning. When MacArthur finished, the delegates applauded politely, but there was no groundswell of support, no movement to draft MacArthur for president. Within days, it was clear: Eisenhower had the votes. He would be the Republican nominee. MacArthur's presidential hopes, such as they were over.
Eisenhower was with his staff when he got the news that the nomination was his. His supporters were celebrating, but Eisenhower took a moment to himself. Someone asked him about MacArthur, about the speech, about the rivalry that everyone had sensed but no one had quite seen played out. And Eisenhower's response was revealing. He said that MacArthur was a great soldier, but according to those present, he also expressed something else. Something that captured years of working together, years of watching, years of judgment. Eisenhower believed that MacArthur could not recognize when he was wrong. It was a devastating assessment. Not angry, not vindictive, just a statement of fact based on years of observation. Eisenhower had worked for MacArthur. He had seen how MacArthur operated, and he had concluded that this quality, this inability to acknowledge error, this absolute certainty in his own rightness, was a fatal flaw for a president. For a military commander leading troops, it could be managed, but for a president who had to work with Congress, with foreign leaders, with the complexity of democracy itself, it was disqualifying. Eisenhower went on to win the presidency in a landslide in November 1952. He defeated Adlai Stevenson decisively, and when he took office in January 1953, one of his first priorities was ending the Korean War, the war that MacArthur had wanted to expand. Eisenhower negotiated an armistice, not a victory, not a total defeat of communism, but an end to the fighting, a practical solution to a difficult problem. MacArthur disagreed with the approach. He believed Eisenhower was too cautious, too willing to accept stalemate. But Eisenhower was president now, and he governed the way he had always led, with consensus, with coalition building, with an eye toward avoiding catastrophe rather than seeking glory. The two men saw each other occasionally over the years. They were always cordial, always polite, but there was a distance, a formality. They knew each other too well. They had worked together too long, and they both understood what had happened. Eisenhower had surpassed MacArthur, not just in rank or position, but in how history would remember them. MacArthur lived until 1964. He gave speeches, he wrote his memoirs, he remained a revered figure to many Americans, but he never achieved the political power he had once sought. He never became president. He faded away, as he had promised, but not in the way he had imagined.
Eisenhower served 2 terms as president. He kept America at peace. He built the interstate highway system. He sent federal troops to enforce school desegregation in Little Rock. He warned about the military-industrial complex, and when he left office in 1961, he was respected as a man who had led with dignity and wisdom, if not always with flair. In his memoirs, Eisenhower wrote about MacArthur. He was generous, noting MacArthur's brilliant mind and his contributions to victory in World War II. But Eisenhower also made his criticisms clear. He noted MacArthur's ego, his tendency to overestimate his own judgment, his difficulty accepting advice from others. These were the observations of someone who had watched MacArthur closely for decades, who had learned from him, but who had also learned what not to do. The rivalry between Eisenhower and MacArthur is one of the most interesting in American history because it was never a simple contest of enemies. They respected each other. They had worked together. They had both served their country with distinction, but they represented fundamentally different approaches to leadership. MacArthur believed in the power of individual genius, in the decisive leader who bends history to his will. Eisenhower believed in teamwork, in careful planning, in listening to others and building consensus. Both men were products of their time. Both were shaped by their experiences. But when the American people had to choose between them, they chose Eisenhower, not once but twice. They chose the man who seemed more balanced, more steady, more capable of navigating the complex challenges of the nuclear age. They chose the man who didn't need to be the hero of every story, who was content to get the job done, even if someone else got the credit. What Eisenhower thought when he learned MacArthur wanted his job revealed everything about their relationship. It revealed the respect Eisenhower had for MacArthur's abilities, but it also revealed the doubts he had about MacArthur's judgment, about his character, about his fitness for the presidency. Eisenhower never campaigned against MacArthur directly. He never attacked him publicly, but he didn't need to. His entire career was an answer to MacArthur's approach to leadership. His success was a repudiation of the idea that great leaders must be larger than life. The story of Eisenhower and MacArthur is ultimately a story about what Americans value in their leaders. Do they want brilliance, or do they want steadiness? Do they want dramatic gestures, or do they want quiet competence? Do they want leaders who inspire awe, or leaders who get things done? In 1952, they answered that question. They chose Eisenhower. And in doing so, they chose a different vision of American leadership, one that would shape the country for decades to come. MacArthur once said that old soldiers fade away, but some soldiers leave legacies that endure. Eisenhower left a legacy of responsible leadership, of putting country before ego, of understanding that the greatest leaders are often those who don't need to tell you how great they are. They just show you through their actions, through their decisions, through their character. That's what Eisenhower understood. That's what MacArthur never quite grasped, and that's why, when history looks back at these two men, it remembers Eisenhower not just as a general who won a war, but as a president who kept the peace. While MacArthur, for all his brilliance, is remembered as a man who could win battles, but couldn't win the ultimate prize he sought, the presidency, the chance to lead not from military headquarters, but from the Oval Office. In the end, Eisenhower's assessment of MacArthur's presidential ambitions was the perfect summary of their relationship: respectful, measured, but ultimately clear-eyed about who was suited for the job and who was not. It wasn't about who was smarter or who was a better general. It was about who understood what the presidency required. And on that question, there was no doubt. Eisenhower knew. MacArthur didn't. And the American people, given the choice, made the right decision. The information presented in this video is derived from published memoirs, historical records, presidential archives, and scholarly biographies cited in the sources. While every effort has been made to ensure accuracy, historical interpretations may vary among scholars and historians. Viewers are encouraged to consult the listed sources for comprehensive research and alternative perspectives. This content is intended for educational purposes.